I have never had to write eulogies of two people that I know something about all in a week. But this is what circumstances foster on people, because in the last few days, two people, General L. Tumwine and Yona Kanyomozi, have passed on, and I knew a thing or two about them. These two men stood on opposing ends of career and politics, yet they shared a singular love for our country, a spirit of public service, a sense of reasonableness and modesty in public matters and public views. They both had a deep conviction of what they believed, so you did not need to doubt their intention when they took a course of action. They were also good at listening. They were good listeners. And most of all, they weren't ashamed of reaching out to those they didn't agree with, if in the process this will lead to genuine contriteness about what needs to be done for the country. Now, I first saw the late Yonasani Kanyomozi somewhere about 1983 when I was in senior one at a school called Bujaga. Bujaga is in the New Rwampara district on the way to Kabale. At our little trading center, I still remember the name, called Buteraniro, 3 kilometers from school. We used to come as students on the highway between Barara and Kabale to buy bananas, sugar, toiletries, but would also use the time to watch different types of trucks and cars plying that route as we whiled away our time on the weekends. Now, Kanyomozi, like the Speaker of the Second Obote Parliament at the time, a gentleman called Francis Obutagira, he would pass by in a navy blue. These things, when you are young, they stick in your head. You remember them like it's yesterday. So Kanyomozi, like Francis Obutagira, would pass by in a navy blue Mercedes-Benz. I can't remember the model, but I knew it was a Mercedes-Benz, navy blue. He would be immaculately dressed in a white safari suit. He would have a colorful protruding pocket square, that little handkerchief that people put here on the breast pocket of his suit. He would wear a red bow tie, and I remember clearly he wore gold-rimmed thick eyeglasses. That's how detailed I remember this man when I was young. He would wave at us as he drove by. Now, but once, Obutagira, even apart from Kanyomozi, he stopped on the road and greeted us, and all we could see was his white safari suit. They had this common safari suit that was white or other colors, but kaunda suit. It would have a red carnation on his breast pocket. This is Obutagira, matching with silver gray shoes. That's what we would see emerging from the car. The shoes would be so shined, you could see a reflection of yourself. They were men that dressed with the times, but they were also men without airs. That's why they would stop by, I guess, to wave and speak to students in 1983. But I got to know and understand a bit of Kanyomozi's politics better when I was in my high school year in 1989, when he and a group of other UPC politicians rejected an order by the UPC headquarters, UPC Secretariat at Uganda House. They defied the order, and they stood in the elections of February 1989 for the National Resistance Council elections. Many young people who I speak to these days were not yet born. These men won convincingly. The NRM had called for expansion of the NRC, and the 173 counties and municipalities in the country at that time, along with 39 district seats for women. All these voters lined behind their candidates of choice all over the country in football fields and SAZA headquarters. The NRC at that time had only, up to that time, 38 members who they used to call historicals. I remember very well, clearly in my mind's eye, Kanyomozi stood in Kajara, Adonia Tiberondo stood in Igara, Francis Obutagira in Rwampara, and I think Anthony Butele in Madiokolo in West Nile, which is now a district. UPC was deemed unpopular in the greater Ankole, Buganda, Bunyoro, and Toro at that time, And it seemed as if someone was tempting fate or committing political suicide for any politician to run on the UPC ticket, given the excesses of some of its leaders in those areas I mentioned that were committed between 1981 and 1985. The acts of UPC youth wingers who were pronounced in Ankole as Bayus, their acts were so fresh in people's mind that even the late Victor Bwana, who was the district administrator in Mbarara at the time, I was in high school, I think he was the DC, he was the SDA, they used to call them, Special District Administrator. He used to say at public rallies, and I quote, "If you want to shout UPC, go to your bedroom, lock it with your wife inside, and shout to each other, raising hands for UPC. Stop there. If you do it outside the house, clearly we will arrest you." And close quote. And people would clap in support of this. I know at that time Bwana had listening ears because of the history of UPC in Mbarara town. Let me give you just one example. In November 1981, some youth wingers vandalized the DP offices on the high street of Mbarara. Those of you who know Mbarara town, they vandalized the offices and they partially torched the building. When the chairman of DP protested to the chairman of UPC and he asked him to deal with the ill-mannered youth, the UPC chairman, the UPC leader at the time, I don't want to mention the name, he replied with impunity and instead praised the actions of the youth, and he said, and I quote, "I understand that the office was not serving its intended purpose. Instead, it was a store. It was used as a store for inflammable substances like diesel and petrol, which were dangerous to the building. Therefore, in view of this very reason, the youth felt concerned and took such action as a rescue operation." Close quote. People, the things you do, they leave behind you because this is all in the archives. If you go to Mbarara Municipal Council and dig up some of these stories are there. This kind of action and many acts such as the disappearance of people, inflation at the time, the scarcity of goods, they were still fresh in 1989 in the minds of the population when Kanyomozi and his group decided to run in NRC elections. Their action in 1989 and their victory, this group that I mentioned, was a brave demonstration that if a leader has not committed deliberate mistakes, listen to me carefully, if a leader has not made deliberate mistakes, the community will always receive them, even if the government in power might think otherwise. Young people of today, you need to know that Kanyomozi, Tiberondwa, and Butagira's victory combined in 1989 was built in their character as politicians long before the NRM. The UPC party primaries in 1984 had been very violent. Two factions had emerged. One was called Syndicate, and it claimed ultra closeness to President Obote, and Syndicate tended to extremity in politics, in approach to politics. They were often the group that was behind the beatings, the disappearances of political opponents, whether inside or outside UPC. Syndicate also tended to have less educated people. Now, the other group, the other faction was called Science. And this Science group was moderate. It wanted to tame the excesses of the military and security forces. It wanted to hold talks with the NRA in the bush, I suppose genuinely. And this Science, these moderate people also opposed the 1982-1983 repatriation, forced repatriation exercise of the Rwandese refugees back to Rwanda. The Syndicate faction was using this as a smokescreen to eliminate opposition to UPC in the entire Ankole. This operation is still in my mind. It was known as Echikwekweto, or the Pandagari version of the villages, which was the cleaning up of rural areas, cleaning them up from DP and UPM elements, and using UPC chiefs and UPC youth wingers and stealing cattle and destroying peasant property. The science faction rejected that. This operation was also deliberately taking Ugandan citizens who they suspected as opponents of UPC and bundled them together as refugees and chased them from their homes. These stories are thereby still known by people like us who follow the chart of history over the years. The science faction opposed this Chikwekwe operation. It is this faction that the three politicians I mentioned belong to, including the late Yona. These moderate people were harassed by the syndicate faction. They were called softies of the NRA and rebels, the NRA rebels. They were called names, DP infiltrators into UPC. They were insulted. You know, in the run-up to these primaries, I remember in the insults, now I don't want to mention people's names, but this is Wizwera and two UPC politicians, one extreme, one syndicate, one science. They were trading serious accusations and supporters, youth, fighting each other. The extremists were doing all this to the moderates simply because the moderates struck a reasonable position, a reasonable tone against the excesses of the UPC at the time. Now, when UPC fell in 1985, the people of Ankole knew something good about these three and other few politicians. They knew that although they belonged to UPC, although they belonged to an organization that had caused mistakes, they were still good men at heart. This is partly the reason they voted them into office in 1989. By defying UPC orders not to run in these elections and going on to defeat NRM candidates, Kanyomozi and his colleagues inadvertently strengthened the issue of individual merit, the individual merit argument against political parties, which they had opposed, that there's something good in an individual leader before you get the collective good. Now, when I knew that, I was a young boy at university at that time, mid-1990s, 1992, 93. Throughout the remainder of those years, I began to seek out some of these politicians, especially Adonia Tuberondwa, the late Dr. Adonia Tuberondwa. And I understood the basis of their thinking. Even at that time when I was young, I found that they were affable men, middle roaders in an argument. They were principled men who held on to the view that politics should be transparently competitive, even if one doesn't think highly of their opponents. They believed that there was no harm to keep in your community and participate in public life and hold opposing views and still find room to work with the government whenever it was deemed necessary. You could argue that these men, one, because NRM at the time was young, was fresh from the bush, with shallow roots in the villages. But it doesn't take away the fact that their action in 1989 removed the shame off the faces of many UPC leaders. And one by one, they all returned to public life. Many of those are now leaders in the NRM. That, in my opinion, was a great contribution that we tend to skip over, contribution that Yona and his group gave to Uganda and to the movement. Their singular brave action to come out and run as early as 1989 helped shape the debate that eventually led us into the constitutional review, eventually giving us the 1995 Constitution. Now, for me, there are two basic lessons that the late Yona Kanyomozi leaves with us. First, we must work hard. We must work hard to avoid doing evil in public office when we have authority. This is because the evil that we do has a way it follows us. It follows the doer, just as the good we do vindicates those who do right. I remember very well as a teenager, all the key UPC functionaries in the Great Ankole. I can name them by name. I don't want to do that. I can name each one of them. and where they came from and what they did. It doesn't matter. What I know is that those functionaries who did wrong, I remember them as a young boy in their power-drunken stupor and how they treated those they didn't like, those with opposing views. However, most of those men and women are no more. They never held public office again. Instead, those like Kanyomozi, who approached power with simplicity, with humility, with a sense of directness, they are alive, they are well in their community, they have nothing to fear as they grow older gracefully, or they are in service of their country in various aspects. Yona belonged to that group. That's why I thought I should do this eulogy. When I last saw him a week ago at a bank in Kampala, I met him in Lugogo, I asked him not to give up on being constructively critical with the failures of an organization, any organization that is in public space, that people have given their trust. I asked him what he sees as the future of our economy and our politics. He looked at me and said, I retired completely from politics since 2011. I will not return. The second lesson is that an organization such as a party, it is a collective vehicle of all hopes and aspirations of its members. They believe that using this vehicle they can transcend factions and petty differences. They can keep growing at the base. We must therefore be careful never to fall for bad behavior and claim this behavior in the name of the party. The bad behavior follows bad behaviored people. It is orchestrated by a few selfish elements, and if they are not held accountable at the time they are in service, history will not absorb them, as the story of UPC shows us. It is better to be on the right side of history as a leader than to gratify today's sensations that won't last. May the good Lord give Yona peaceful rest.